Hey guys, tonight we're not just talking about history. We're stepping back in time, way back to ancient Rome, to witness a truly baffling phenomenon. Imagine, if you will, the flickering oil lamps casting long, dancing shadows across marble floors, the scent of exotic spices mingling with something distinctly unmodern, perhaps a hint of laurel wreath and too much fermented fish sauce. You're there, nestled among the elite, observing a man unlike any other emperor Rome had seen. A man who, despite the vast riches of an empire at his fingertips, supposedly ate only one meal a day. Just one. Now, before you mentally hype him for his self-discipline, let me tell you that single meal was less about intermittent fasting and more about, well, you'll see. You probably won't survive his dinner party, even as a spectator. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me, where are you tuning in from tonight, and what time is it there? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our story begins in the dizzying, often ridiculous, year of 69 CE. Forget your modern-day political dramas. This was Rome's ultimate reality show, where the contestants rarely made it to the reunion special. It was a year that saw not one, not two, but 4 emperors claw their way to the top, only to be violently deposed, usually within months. The air in Rome was thick with ambition, betrayal, and the lingering scent of smoke from countless insurrections. It was a time when the mighty Roman Empire, that seemingly indestructible colossus, wobbled precariously on its foundations, teetering on the edge of utter chaos. And right into this maelstrom stumbled Aulus Vitellius Germanicus, our peculiar protagonist, a man destined to leave his mark on history, not for his military prowess or his administrative genius. See, for most Romans, dining was a structured, if sometimes lavish, affair. Breakfast was usually light, lunch a bit more substantial, and dinner the cena, the main event. But Vitellius, oh no, he decided to streamline. One meal, that's it. Now, don't picture a lean, ascetic figure practicing some ancient form of stoic minimalism. Quite the opposite. Imagine a man of considerable girth, whose very presence seemed to consume the available light. A man whose reputation for gluttony preceded him, like a very well-fed herald. Historians still argue whether his one meal a day was a genuine habit, perhaps a bizarre form of imperial efficiency, or merely a clever exaggeration, a way to focus all his Epicurean energies into a single monumental sitting. Was it a challenge he set for himself, or simply the most efficient way to maximize pleasure? The sources, as we'll gently discover, lean heavily towards the latter. He was, to put it mildly, a dedicated foodie of the highest, or perhaps lowest, order. You might wonder how one person could even manage such a feat, and the answer, as with many things in ancient Rome, often involved more than a little excess and a distinct lack of self-restraint. It was a time when opulence was not just admired but expected, and, for an emperor, every action, even a meal, was a performance. So, you're now firmly planted in the year 69 CE, a frantic tuba solo with a cymbal crash every 5 minutes. The stage is set for our man Vitellius, but before he takes center stage as the emperor who redefined all you can eat, let's briefly rewind to understand the political earthquake that thrust him into power. No peaceful passing of the imperial torch. This was a brutal, no-holds-barred fight for the top job, and the contenders were dropping faster than your New Year's resolutions. It all started, rather innocently, with the death of Nero. Remember, Nero, the fiddling, burning, artistic Bodhirampara type. His demise in 68 CE left a massive power vacuum, and nature, or at least Roman nature, abhors a vacuum. First up was Galba, an elderly, somewhat rigid general. He strutted into Rome, probably thinking, finally, my time has come. But his stinginess and inability to play nice with the Praetorian Guard, Rome's elite bodyguard unit, who, let's be honest, held all the real power, quickly sealed his fate. You can almost hear the grumbling from the barracks. No bonus, seriously. Galba lasted a grand total of 7 months. His reign ended rather messily in the Forum, demonstrating that in Roman politics, a good retirement plan was simply not getting stabbed. Then came Otho, a suave, ambitious, and slightly shady character, who had been a loyal friend to Nero, believe it or not. He was quick-witted and knew how to charm the troops, securing the support of the very Praetorians who had just offed Galba. You might think, finally, some stability. But alas, Rome in 69 CE wasn't interested in stability. Otho's claim was immediately challenged by legions stationed in Germania who had a different candidate in mind, our very own Vitellius. So, within weeks, Rome was plunged into civil war. Armies marched, battles raged, and the entire empire held its breath, wondering who would emerge victorious from this bloody imperial slugfest. It was a brutal reminder that even an empire as vast and powerful as Rome could be torn apart from within by the ambitions of a few powerful men. This period, often called the Year of the Four Emperors, truly underscores how fragile power could be, even for the self-proclaimed masters of the world. It wasn't about bloodlines anymore, or even necessarily military genius, but about who could command the loyalty of the legions, and crucially, the Praetorian Guard. Historians still argue whether this turbulent year was an inevitable consequence of Nero's chaotic reign, a sign of deeper structural weaknesses in the imperial system, or simply a series of unfortunate coincidences born from individual ambition. Perhaps it was a bit of all three, a perfect storm of political instability and personal greed. But one thing is clear: without this period of profound upheaval, a man like Vitellius, otherwise unremarkable in his political acumen, might never have found himself draped in imperial purple, let alone with a dining table big enough to hold his infamous single meal. You can almost feel the tension in the air, the constant whisper of conspiracy, the fear of sudden violence that permeated every aspect of Roman life. It's enough to make you just want to curl up with a good book, or, in Vitellius's case, a good, enormous meal. So, the political stage is a chaotic whirlwind, a Roman version of musical chairs, where the loser gets a dagger instead of a consolation prize. Aulus Vitellius. Now, you might be imagining a seasoned general, a charismatic orator, or a brilliant administrator. Dispel those images immediately. Vitellius he was pretty unremarkable. His family wasn't exactly obscure, but they certainly weren't the Julio-Claudians, the ancient equivalent of rock stars. His father, Lucius Vitellius, had been a pretty successful politician, serving as consul 3 times and even governing Syria. So, they weren't exactly living in a mud hut. But they weren't sending out gilded invitations to dinner with the gods either. Young Aulus, our future, one meal day emperor, was born in 15 CE. His early life seems to have been marked more by a fondness for luxury and rather dubious company than by any great intellectual or martial pursuits. He was, by all accounts, a charming fellow, good-natured, and seemingly harmless. The kind of person you'd invite to a party because he'd keep the wine flowing and the conversation light, but probably not the person you'd entrust with the keys to the empire. He spent his youth flitting around the imperial court, cultivating friendships with various emperors, including the truly dreadful Caligula, the somewhat odd Claudius, and of course, the infamous Nero. He was, to put it mildly, a social chameleon, able to adapt to the peculiar whims of each imperial master. You might say he was a master of networking, Roman style, which mostly involved flattering the powerful and avoiding their wrath. It's said that Caligula found him amusing, and Nero, not in governance or warfare, but in the art of the feast. He wasn't just attending these dinners. He was observing, learning, perhaps even participating in the competitive eating that characterized some of Nero's more extravagant affairs. Quirk, it began to define him, to become part of his public persona. Historians still argue whether his early life truly set the stage for his later culinary excesses. Was he always destined to be a gourmand of epic proportions, or did the temptations of the imperial table simply amplify an existing fondness for food? He was known for his love of dice games and chariot races, typically Roman aristocratic pastimes, but without any particular distinction in either. He held a few minor political offices, but nothing that would suggest he was destined for greatness. He was, in essence, a perfectly mediocre Roman noble, content to live a life of comfort and pleasure. And yet, this seemingly uninspired man, this connoisseur of banquets and casual imperial friendships, was about to be swept up in the most violent political upheaval Rome had seen in decades. Candidate from the crowd and hand him the reins of power, just to see what would happen. And what happened, dear listener, involved a lot of food. So, our affable, this guy, an emperor? No way. And for a long time, you'd have been absolutely right. He wasn't a grizzled veteran leading legions to victory against barbarian hordes. He wasn't a brilliant tactician poring over maps in a smoky tent. Instead, his appointments seemed to be more a consequence of imperial favor, vital to mess up. He served as a legate, a commander in Africa. Now, don't picture him bravely facing down lions or negotiating intricate treaties with local tribes. From what we can gather, his time there was more about maintaining the status quo, overseeing administrative duties, and probably enjoying the local cuisine. It was a comfortable posting, far from the cutthroat politics of Rome, a place where a man could enjoy a leisurely pace of life without too much imperial scrutiny. You can almost imagine him sighing contentedly, perhaps dabbling in some local delicacies, entirely unaware that the wheels of fate were slowly came in 68 CE when Emperor Galba, in a move that historians still scratch their heads over, made him governor of Germania, Inferior Germania, that wild, untamed frontier, bristling with disgruntled legions and even more disgruntled barbarian tribes, generals who could command respect and keep unruly soldiers in line. Vitellius, however, was known more for his love of banquets than his battlefield prowess. You might wonder, as many Romans probably did at the time, what on earth Galba was thinking. Was it an oversight, a deliberate insult, or perhaps, as some scholars quietly debate, was Galba subtly trying to get rid of Vitellius by sending him to a challenging, potentially career-ending assignment? Whatever Galba's reasoning, disappointment proved to be Vitellius's unlikely ticket to the top. They hated Galba. They were ripe for rebellion, just waiting for a leader to rally around. And into this powder keg walked Vitellius, not as a stern disciplinarian, but as a surprisingly affable, easygoing figure. He didn't crack down on them. Instead, he loosened discipline, mingled freely, and, crucially, he started buying them drinks and food. Lots of it. You see, Vitellius knew the way to a soldier's heart wasn't always through a rigorous training regimen, rather than brute force. He was the kind of general who would join you for a round of dice after drill, not just bark orders from afar. This seemingly lackadaisical approach endeared him to the legions, and in the volatile climate of 69 CE, popularity with the legions was far more valuable than a lifetime of military victories. He was building loyalty, not through fear, but through a shared love of let's just say, the comforts of life. So there you are, watching Vitellius in Germania, probably shaking your head. This man, whose primary talent seemed to be making friends over a good meal, was now in charge of some of Rome's most formidable and notoriously restless legions. It's like putting a pastry chef in charge of a tank division. But here's the thing. Sometimes, in moments of utter chaos, the least likely candidate can stumble into destiny. And stumble he did, right onto the road to the purple dot, the legions in Germania. Underpaid and generally disrespected. They saw Galba as an old miser who didn't understand their needs, which primarily involved more money and less discipline. Vitellius, on the other hand, arrived and immediately started acting like their best mate, allowed them more freedom, and most importantly, he was generous with resources, even if it meant dipping into his own somewhat substantial coffers. He was buying them loyalty with kindness and, you guessed it, food and drink. Imagine a general who throws parties instead of demanding forced marches. The soldiers, suddenly, whispers started circulating among the troops. Galba is weak. They'd mutter over their evening rations. Otho is just another Nero wannabe. But Vitellius, he's one of us. This sentiment, fueled by charm and willingness to indulge their desires, quickly escalated. On January 2nd, 69 CE, the legions in Germania Inferior, without consulting Rome or really anyone else, declared Vitellius emperor, sought the emperorship from the outset, or if he was simply a convenient figurehead for the legion's simmering discontent. The truth, as often in history, is probably somewhere in the murky middle. News traveled slowly in the Roman Empire, but when it did, it hit like a brick. Back in Rome, Galba probably choked on his breakfast when he heard Otho, who had just managed to snatch the throne from Galba, must have felt a cold dread. Quietly, Vitellius, perhaps initially surprised by his sudden elevation, quickly embraced the role. This was no longer about comfortable banquets. This was about war. He began assembling his forces, rallying other legions along the Rhine frontier who were equally disillusioned with the state of affairs in Rome. His lieutenants, men like Caecina, Aelianus, and Fabius Valens, were more seasoned military commanders than Vitellius himself, and they proved invaluable in organizing the advance to guide the actual military machine. It's like having a brilliant chef who needs a good manager to run the restaurant. And so, a man who seemed destined for a life of comfortable obscurity, a man known more for his Epicurean pursuits than his political ambition, suddenly found himself leading an army towards the very heart of the empire, propelled by the discontent of his soldiers and the sheer, unpredictable chaos of the year of 4 emperors. And so, the stage is set for an epic, if rather brief, confrontation. You're watching as 2 massive Roman armies, each believing their man is the rightful emperor, begin to converge. This isn't just a political squabble. It's a full-blown civil war, legions against legions, brother against brother. The year of 4 emperors, as you recall, was already a messy affair, with Galba's ignominious end and Otho's swift ascent. But now, with Vitellius and his German legions marching south, the true horror of Roman infighting was about to unfold. Otho, for all his charm and political maneuvering, wasn't a military genius. He was a dandy, a courtier, and while he had the loyalty of the Praetorian Guard, Vitellius had the grizzled veterans from the Rhine, troops who had faced down barbarians and were spoiling for a fight. The decisive clash came at the Battle of Bedriacum, near Cremona in northern Italy. Imagine the scene: thousands of disciplined soldiers clanking armor, the sun glinting off helmets, the dust rising in great clouds as 2 vast forces prepared to collide. It would have been a deafening cacophony of war cries, the thud of pila javelins flying through the air, and the clang of gladius on shield. The battle itself was brutal, a grinding, bloody affair that lasted for hours. Otho's forces, despite some initial successes, were eventually outmaneuvered and overwhelmed by the sheer ferocity and discipline of Vitellius's legions. It was a crushing defeat for Otho, and when the news reached him, rather than prolong the agony and plunge Rome into further bloodshed, he made a surprising decision. Otho chose to commit suicide. You might think, well, that's surprisingly noble for a Roman emperor. And in a way, it was. He stated that he did not want to be the cause of further Roman deaths, a sentiment that, whether entirely sincere or a calculated move for historical posterity, certainly stands out amidst the general savagery of the era. He knew his cause was lost and perhaps, with a melancholic sigh, decided to spare Rome another round of civil strife. With Otho's death, the path was clear. Vitellius, the unexpected candidate, the gourmand-turned-general, was now the undisputed master of the Roman world. News of his victory spread quickly, and Rome, ever pragmatic, quickly shifted its allegiance. Senators, who had just been fawning over Otho, were now scrambling to send lavish congratulations to Vitellius. You can almost see them polishing their silver plates and preparing their finest wines for his arrival. It was a dizzying display of political opportunism, a testament to the fleeting nature of power in Rome during this chaotic year. Historians still argue whether Otho's suicide truly prevented further bloodshed or if it merely delayed the inevitable, given the other powerful factions still lurking in the shadows. But for the moment, Rome breathed a collective sigh of relief. The civil war, for a fleeting moment, seemed over. Vitellius made his triumphal entry into the city, not as a stern conqueror, but reportedly as a jovial, rather portly figure, eager to embrace the spoils of victory. And for Vitellius, the spoils of victory were not just political power, but the opportunity to indulge his legendary appetite on an unprecedented imperial scale. The real feasting, you see, was just about to begin. So you're standing there, amidst the cheering crowds of Rome, watching Vitellius make his grand entrance. He's not exactly the stoic, marble-chinned leader you might imagine gracing Roman coins. No, Vitellius, by all accounts, was rather stout, with a ruddy complexion, perhaps a testament to his love of the finer things in life, particularly food and wine. He entered the city not with the grim determination of a conqueror, but with a surprising joviality, like a favorite uncle arriving for a holiday feast. His imperial style, once he settled onto the throne, was less about grand pronouncements and more about grand banquets. He quickly became known for his extravagant lifestyle, and his court mirrored his personal inclinations. This wasn't an emperor who spent his evenings poring over legal codes or strategic maps. No, Vitellius was a man who appreciated comfort, luxury, and above all, exquisite cuisine. He reportedly spent vast sums of money on his dining habits, famously holding 3 or 4 elaborate feasts a day, often with different hosts providing the venues. You might think, well, that's just typical Roman excess, and you'd be partly right. The Roman elite certainly knew how to party, but Vitellius took it to another level, turning imperial dining into an art form, or perhaps a competitive sport. He loved being entertained, and his court was filled with actors, charioteers, and, naturally, master chefs. He was a patron of the performing arts, but he was an even greater patron of the culinary arts. One of the quirks of his reign was his particular fondness for being invited to private dinners, rather than hosting all of them himself. He would apparently turn up with a huge retinue, expecting to be fed, and his hosts, terrified of offending the emperor, would spare no expense. Imagine the frantic scramble in those Roman kitchens when the emperor's entourage suddenly appeared. At your doorstep. Quick, get out the good amphorae. Is there enough peacock brain? It must have been a nightmare for any aspiring host's budget. His love for food wasn't just a private indulgence. It became a public spectacle. Rumors of his lavish dinners spread throughout Rome, sometimes whispered with awe, sometimes with disgust. In a society that valued moderation, at least outwardly, Vitellius's excesses were notable. Yet, in the immediate aftermath of civil war, perhaps a bit of imperial merriment was seen by some as a welcome distraction. It certainly beat another emperor dying violently. Historians still argue whether his excessive feasting was a deliberate, projected an image of imperial abundance and generosity, a way to win over the populace through shared indulgence, or simply the unbridled manifestation of a personal vice now unrestrained by power. Perhaps it was a cunning strategy to appear approachable. The emperor who loved to eat, just like, well, not everyone, but certainly a good many Romans. After all, what's more relatable than enjoying a good meal? If that meal happens to cost a fortune and feature exotic birds, well, that's just imperial flair, all right? Settle in, because this is where the legend of Vitellius truly takes shape. You've heard about his general love for the good life, his penchant for banquets. But now, we're going to dive deep into the specific, truly astonishing details of his one meal a day. Remember that promise from the title. It wasn't a humble bowl of porridge. Oh no, This was the culinary equivalent of an Olympic event, a single, monumental sitting that would make a modern-day competitive eater blush. Vitellius's daily dining ritual was a spectacle of excess. He wouldn't eat breakfast or lunch in the traditional sense. Instead, he would spend the entire day preparing for and then consuming one gargantuan dinner. This wasn't just a meal. It was an immersive, multisensory experience designed to maximize pleasure and demonstrate imperial power. Imagine being there, the sheer volume of food being brought out, course after course, each more elaborate than the last. We're talking about vast platters, groaning under the weight of exotic meats, rare fish, and vegetables from every corner of the empire. His favorite dishes were reportedly those that combined various expensive ingredients. Think of it less as a meal and more as a living, breathing testament to conspicuous consumption. The sheer logistics of preparing such a feast daily would have been staggering. We're talking about a kitchen staff working tirelessly, sourcing ingredients from far-flung provinces, probably inventing new dishes on the fly just to keep things interesting for the imperial palate. The scale of it all is almost incomprehensible. You're not just eating, you're embarking on a culinary journey that lasts for hours, possibly stretching from late afternoon well into the night. One of the most famous anecdotes, recounted by ancient historians like Suetonius, describes a particular dish that became synonymous with Vitellius's gluttony, the Satura Lanx. This wasn't just a dish, it was an entire banquet on a single platter, a culinary monstrosity designed to showcase the empire's bounty and Vitellius's boundless appetite. We'll get to the specifics of that wondrous creation in the next section, but suffice it to say it involved more animal parts than a particularly busy Roman abattoir. This single meal habit wasn't about efficiency or a bizarre health regimen. It was about concentration of pleasure. Instead of spreading his indulgence throughout the day, he funneled it all into one epic session. It was his way of maximizing the joy of eating to fully immerse himself in the sensory experience of food. You can almost hear him sighing with contentment between bites, perhaps offering a witty, albeit food-centric, remark to a nervous guest. Historians still argue whether his one meal a day was a genuine personal preference, perhaps a way to consolidate his imperial authority through unparalleled feasting, or simply the most efficient method for a man of his gargantuan appetite to consume the vast quantities of food he desired. Was it a carefully curated public image, or just how he genuinely preferred to live? Regardless, it certainly left an impression, both on his contemporaries and on history itself. You'd probably need a team of assistants just to clear the table. All right, let's peel back the layers of legend and dive into the glorious, grotesque details of the Satura Lanx. You're still at that single, epic meal with Vitellius, and now the piece de resistance is being brought forth. Imagine a platter so vast it practically needs its own chariot to be wheeled in. This wasn't just a serving dish. It was a testament to Roman engineering and Vitellius's unyielding pursuit of culinary excess. The Satura Lanx, according to ancient accounts, was a monstrous, multi-layered concoction, a true gastronomic Frankenstein's monster. What went into this legendary dish? Hold onto your toga, because it's a list that would make a modern-day health inspector faint. We're talking about the livers of parrotfish. Yes, parrotfish. which were considered a delicacy, but certainly not an easy catch. Then the brains of pheasants and peacocks, probably plucked from birds that had been strutting around imperial aviaries just moments before. These weren't just any birds. These were exotic, expensive, and difficult to procure. Imagine the poor Roman chef to explain that specific ingredient order to the fishmonger or the poultry supplier. Just the brains, mind you, and make sure they're fresh. But it didn't stop there. Oh no. The Satura Lanx also featured the tongues of flamingos. Flamingos, a creature more known for its graceful pink plumage than its meaty tongue. This truly highlights the lengths to which imperial chefs, under Vitellius's discerning palate, would go to procure the most unusual and expensive ingredients. And finally, the ultimate indulgence, the lamprey milts, essentially the testicles of lampreys. These were fish considered a great delicacy, especially when prepared just so. So, you had this bizarre, almost surreal mix of land and sea creatures, all on one platter, all prepared to satisfy the singular, demanding appetite of the emperor. The very name, Satura Lanx, is revealing. Satura comes from the Latin for full, or satiated, and also gives us our word satire, perhaps hinting at the ridiculousness of such a dish. Lanx simply means a large platter or dish. So, it was literally a full platter, but in the most spectacularly over-the-top sense. This wasn't food for sustenance. It was food as a display of power, as a performance, as an almost comedic embrace of unbridled indulgence. You can almost hear the gentle clink of expensive silverware against the massive platter, perhaps the quiet slurp of the emperor, enjoying another exotic morsel. Historians still debate the exact preparation of the Satura Lanx. Was it a stew, a pie, a grand assembly of roasted parts? Most likely, it was a combination, a culinary mosaic designed to offer a variety of textures and flavors. It served as a potent symbol of Vitellius's reign, an emperor who, by all accounts, presided over a period of relative peace and stability in Rome itself, but at a cost that was literally being consumed at his dinner table. It was a strange juxtaposition, a calm imperial city, and a wildly extravagant emperor whose legendary meals were becoming the talk of the town, forever cementing his place in the annals of Roman gluttony. You'd need an entire team of food tasters just to get through this single epic dish, let alone the rest of his magnificent meal. So you've just witnessed, or at least imagined, the spectacle of the Satura Lanx being served up to Vitellius. Now, you might be wondering, what did everyone else think of this? How did the Roman populace, from the grizzled senators to the common plebs, react to an emperor whose dining habits were apparently more legendary than his statesmanship? Well, public perception was, shall we say, a mixed bag, and certainly a topic of much hushed conversation or outright grumbling, depending on who you were talking to. For the Roman elite, particularly the more traditional and conservative elements, Vitellius's excesses were a source of deep disapproval. The old Roman virtues of frugalitas, frugality, and gravitas, seriousness, dignity, were still held up as ideals, even if rarely practiced. An emperor who openly indulged in such gluttony was seen as lacking in dignity, demonstrating poor judgment and setting a terrible example. They probably sighed dramatically into their wine cups, lamenting the decline of Roman morals. You can almost hear the whispered conversations at dinner parties, not Vitellius's dinners, of course, but the more restrained ones. Did you hear about the flamingo tongues? It's simply scandalous. It was a clear sign to them that he was unfit to rule such a mighty empire. However, for the common people, the reaction was perhaps more complex. On one hand, there was probably a degree of awe, even a perverse fascination with such extreme wealth and indulgence. Imagine the rumors spreading through the forum. The emperor ate how many brains in one sitting? It was certainly entertaining, a juicy piece of gossip that made the tediousness of daily life a little more bearable. Some might have even seen it as a sign of imperial generosity, that the empire was so prosperous that its leader could afford such extravagance. It was like watching a particularly over-the-top celebrity chef show, but in real life with much higher stakes. Yet, as time wore on and the cost of Vitellius's lavish lifestyle became more apparent, even the ordinary Romans likely grew weary. Such excess meant money flowing out of the imperial treasury and, inevitably, more taxes or less public spending. This is where the gentle humor turns a bit sour. While a few extravagant banquets might be amusing, a continuous daily display of unbridled gluttony begins to grate, especially when Rome was still recovering from the civil wars. The initial novelty probably wore off, replaced by a growing sense of resentment. "He's eating our tax money" would have been a common sentiment. Echoing through the crowded streets, historians still argue whether the ancient sources, primarily Suetonius and Tacitus, exaggerated Vitellius's gluttony for rhetorical effect. Were his meals truly as monstrous as described, or were they embellished to paint him as a weak and debauched emperor by later, often biased historians? While there's certainly a tendency for ancient writers to sensationalize, the sheer volume of anecdotes suggests that his eating habits were indeed remarkable and a defining feature of his brief reign. He simply couldn't escape the reputation, a reputation that, for better or worse, has clung to his name for 2 millennia. It's a reminder that even in ancient times, public image, especially related to personal habits, could make or break a ruler, and in Vitellius's case, his fork was almost as mighty as his scepter. So, you're witnessing the Roman public's uneasy fascination with Vitellius's gastronomic adventures. It's all very entertaining, isn't it? An emperor whose greatest strategic maneuvers seem to happen between the kitchen and the dining room. But, as with all truly extravagant habits, there was a significant downside, a hidden cost that went far beyond the immediate expense of peacock brains and flamingo tongues. We're talking about the economic impact, the very real financial strain that Vitellius's insatiable appetite put on the vast, intricate machinery of the Roman Empire. Imagine, for a moment, the imperial treasury. It's not an endless pit of gold. While Rome was incredibly wealthy, it was constantly funding legions scattered across vast frontiers, maintaining an extensive road network, supporting massive public works, and providing grain doles to its massive population. Every cent spent on a lavish banquet was a sesterce that couldn't be used for something else. And Vitellius wasn't just having a lavish dinner once a week. He was doing it multiple times a day, with a retinue of hundreds, for months on end. The cumulative cost would have been astronomical. Ancient sources, though prone to exaggeration, paint a consistent picture of imperial coffers being rapidly depleted. Suetonius, that delightful chronicler of imperial gossip, claims that Vitellius spent 900 million sesterces in just 7 months on feasts alone. Now, to put that into perspective, 900 million sesterces was an absolutely staggering sum, enough to fund several legions for years, or build an impressive number of temples and aqueducts. Whether that precise figure is accurate, the underlying message is clear. Vitellius was bleeding the imperial treasury dry. You can almost hear the imperial accountants weeping quietly into their abacuses. Another banquet, Caesar. But the grain reserves are looking a bit thin. This kind of profligacy had real consequences. When the treasury is empty, money has to come from somewhere. That usually means higher taxes on the provinces, or perhaps the debasement of coinage, both of which could lead to widespread discontent and economic instability. Troops might not get paid on time, public services could suffer, and the carefully balanced economic ecosystem of the empire would begin to creak under the strain. This isn't just about an emperor enjoying his food. It's about the broader implications of unchecked imperial spending on a system that relied on consistent revenue and prudent management. Historians still argue whether Vitellius was genuinely oblivious to the financial consequences of his lifestyle, or if he simply didn't care, believing that the empire's wealth was his personal playground. Was his spending purely self-indulgent, or was it a desperate attempt to maintain popularity through lavish displays, reminiscent of Nero's bread and circuses? Regardless of his intent, the practical effect was a financial hemorrhage at a time when the empire desperately needed stability and careful stewardship after the chaos of the civil wars. The delicious irony, of course, is that while Vitellius was literally eating his way through the Roman treasury, another, more disciplined, and ultimately more frugal general was quietly consolidating his power in the East, preparing to challenge the emperor whose waistline was growing almost as quickly as his debts. The stage was being set for another, final act in the turbulent drama of 69 CE. You're still watching, perhaps with a slight rumble in your own stomach, as Vitellius continues his gastronomic reign. The imperial kitchen is humming, the wine flows freely, and the bills are piling up faster than discarded flamingo tongues. But while our food-loving emperor is happily indulging in his magnificent single meal, far away in the east, a new storm is brewing, and this storm has a name, Vespasian. Remember how turbulent 69 CE was? Well, it wasn't quite finished with its imperial musical chairs just yet. While Vitellius was solidifying his rule through feasting, the legions in the east, particularly those stationed in Judea, had other ideas. Their commander was Titus Flavius Vespasianus, a seasoned general. Unlike our current emperor, Vespasian was a no-nonsense, pragmatic soldier who had gained significant military experience suppressing the Jewish revolt. He wasn't known for his charm or his lavish banquets. He was known for his competence, his frugality, and his ability to get things done. You might call him the anti-Vitellius news. Of Vitellius's excesses and the financial drain on the empire had reached the legions in the east. They watched, perhaps with a mix of amusement and disdain, as reports of the Satura Lanx and the endless feasting filtered through the military grapevine. To these hardened soldiers, accustomed to the rigors of campaign life, an emperor more interested in exotic foods than efficient governance, seemed like a bizarre joke. They needed a strong, stable leader, not a walking buffet. And so, on July 1st, 69 CE, the legions in Egypt, quickly followed by those in Judea and Syria, proclaimed Vespasian emperor. This was no surprise to Vespasian. Indeed, it had likely been carefully orchestrated by his supporters, chief among them Tiberius Alexander, the prefect of Egypt, and Mucianus, the governor of Syria. These were serious, politically astute men who recognized Vitellius's weaknesses and Vespasian's strengths. This wasn't a spontaneous uprising born from a general's affable nature like Vitellius's ascent. This was a calculated move by powerful individuals. The challenge was laid down. Vitellius, basking in his imperial feasting, suddenly faced a formidable rival. Vespasian immediately secured the crucial grain supply from Egypt, effectively holding Rome's stomach in his hand. He also dispatched Mucianus with a significant force to march on Italy, while Vespasian himself prepared to follow. This was a clear message to Vitellius. Your dinner party is about to be interrupted. Historians still argue whether Vespasian was initially reluctant to seize the throne, only doing so at the urging of his allies, or if he had harbored imperial ambitions all along, merely waiting for the opportune moment. His later reign certainly proved him to be an incredibly capable ruler, suggesting a strong strategic mind. Regardless, the stage was now set for the final bloody act of the year of 4 emperors. The contrast couldn't have been starker. On one side, an emperor lost in a world of culinary delights. On the other, a battle-hardened general ready to reclaim Rome from what he likely saw as a gluttonous, incompetent ruler. The clock was ticking for Vitellius, and not even the most elaborate banquet could save him now. So, the final showdown is looming. You've watched Vitellius rise and fall, not by the sword of a foreign enemy, but by the sheer unyielding force of his appetite and the shifting tides of Roman politics. Vespasian, the pragmatic general, is marching from the east, a stark contrast to our food-loving emperor. Vitellius, however, seemed strangely oblivious or simply indifferent to the gathering storm. While Vespasian's legions were on the move, Vitellius was still presiding over his lavish banquets, perhaps believing that his popularity in Rome, or simply the logistical difficulties of a distant campaign, would deter his challenger. He seemed more concerned with the next course than the next battle. The decisive blow came, once again, in Italy. Vitellius's forces, led by his generals, met Vespasian's advancing armies, commanded by Antonius Primus, in a second, even more brutal battle. Near Cremona, the same site as the earlier clash that had brought Vitellius to power, this time the outcome was different. Vespasian's legions, disciplined and determined, crushed Vitellius's remaining forces. The battle was fought at night, a chaotic, terrifying affair illuminated by the flames of burning camps and the flashes of weapons. Imagine the disorienting horror of fighting in the dark, the shouts and screams echoing through the night. It was a complete rout, and the path to Rome lay open for Vespasian. As news of the devastating defeat reached Rome, panic set in. Vitellius, still holed up in the imperial palace, seemed paralyzed by indecision. He tried to negotiate, to abdicate, even to hide. He was reportedly caught in the palace, attempting to escape dressed in humble clothing. or perhaps even hiding in a porter's lodge, desperately trying to blend in. The image is almost comically pathetic. The emperor, known for his grand dining halls, reduced to scuttling through back corridors, trying to avoid his fate. It's a vivid reminder that the mighty can fall very far indeed. His capture was swift and brutal. Dragged through the streets of Rome, he was subjected to every indignity imaginable. The very populace that had once cheered him, or at least tolerated his excesses, now turned on him with a vengeance. They pelted him with dung and insults, mockery replacing their previous awe. He was paraded through the city, his hands tied behind his back, a rope around his neck. It was a gruesome, humiliating end for a man who had briefly commanded the world's greatest empire. His final moments were particularly ignominious. He was reportedly dragged to the Gemonian stairs, a place where the bodies of criminals were often displayed, and then thrown into the Tiber River. His last words, according to some accounts, were a defiant, "Yet I was your emperor," before he was brutally killed by the mob. His body was then thrown into the Tiber, denied a proper burial, a final act of contempt for the emperor who had eaten too much. Historians still argue whether Vitellius truly showed courage in his final moments, or if his defiance was simply a desperate, perhaps confused, outburst. What is clear is that his end was as undignified as his rise had been unexpected. And so, just 8 months after ascending to the throne, the emperor of the single epic meal met his inglorious end, clearing the way for a new dynasty and a period of much-needed stability. You've witnessed the rise and inglorious fall of Aulus Vitellius, the emperor whose appetite became his most enduring, if peculiar, legacy. But now, as the dust settles and Vespasian takes the reins, it's worth pausing to consider how history, that grand and often judgmental storyteller, has treated Vitellius. Was he truly just a gluttonous buffoon, or was there more to the story? For centuries, Vitellius has been largely remembered as the quintessential bad emperor, a figure of fun and contempt. Ancient historians, like Suetonius and Tacitus, who are our primary sources, painted him in a distinctly unflattering light. They emphasized his laziness, his gluttony, and his lack of military or administrative skill. You might hear his name and immediately think fat, lazy, indulgent. And certainly, the anecdotes about the Satura Lanx and his constant feasting have stuck like glue, overshadowing almost anything else he might have done. It's almost as if his culinary excesses were so remarkable that they consumed his entire historical narrative. Much like he consumed his daily meal, however, modern scholarship has, as it often does, started to look a little closer, to peel back the layers of ancient bias. While no one is arguing that Vitellius was a brilliant statesman or a military genius, some historians suggest that his portrayal might be overly harsh, influenced by the fact that he was eventually overthrown by the Flavian dynasty Vespasian's family, whose historians would naturally want to legitimize their own rule by disparaging their predecessors. It's like the winning political party writing the history books. They're rarely going to be kind to the losers. There's a quirky tidbit here. Despite his reputation for self-indulgence, Vitellius actually made some attempts at administrative reform during his brief reign. He reportedly tried to restore some financial order and even initiated a public census. These efforts often get lost amidst the tales of his banquets. Historians still argue whether these were genuine attempts at good governance or merely token gestures overshadowed by his personal habits. Was he a fundamentally good man ruined by power and temptation, or simply an incompetent one whose gluttony merely provided good anecdotal fodder? Perhaps he was just out of his depth, a decent enough man swept into an impossible situation. His reign, though short, also saw a period of relative peace within Rome itself, at least until Vespasian's forces reached the city gates. The civil wars were fought primarily by his generals in the provinces and for the citizens of Rome. His rule might have initially felt like a return to normalcy after the madness of Galba and Otho. He wasn't particularly cruel or tyrannical, at least not in the way some emperors were. His biggest vice seemed to be simply enjoying life, perhaps a little too much, and certainly in a manner deemed unimperial by the Stoic standards of Roman virtue. He simply loved food, and that, it seems, was his undoing in the eyes of history. It's a reminder that sometimes it's not the grand, dramatic actions that define a historical figure, but the seemingly mundane, yet endlessly fascinating quirks of their personal life. So you've journeyed through the short, remarkable reign of Vitellius, the emperor who redefined the concept of a single meal. We've explored the chaos that brought him to power, the delightful details of his legendary Satura Lanx, and the ignominious end that solidified his place in history as Rome's most famous gourmand. But as we gently drift towards the end of our story, let's take a moment to reflect on what Vitellius's obsession with food and Roman food culture in general really tells us about this ancient civilization. You see, food in Rome wasn't just sustenance. It was a mirror reflecting society, status, and power. The grandeur of Vitellius's banquets wasn't just about his personal enjoyment. It was a declaration. It was his way of saying, "I am emperor, and the wealth of the world is at my table." The more exotic the ingredients, the more elaborate the presentation, the greater the display of influence and control over vast networks of trade and tribute. You can almost taste the empire in every bite of that flamingo tongue. The Roman palate was incredibly diverse, and their culinary practices were far more sophisticated than simply boiled cabbage. They loved strong flavors, fermented sauces, and complex combinations of ingredients. The sheer variety of food consumed, from dormice stuffed with pork and pine nuts, to garum, a pungent fish sauce that was basically their ketchup, reveals a society that celebrated Epicureanism. Yet, there was always a tension between this love of luxury and the traditional Roman ideal of virtues, a concept embodying masculine strength, courage, and austerity. Vitellius, with his overt indulgence, seemingly thumbed his nose at this ideal, and in doing so, became an easy target for criticism. It's fascinating to consider how much we can learn about a culture through its food. The banquets of the elite weren't just meals. They were social events, political forums, and opportunities for display. The kind of food served, the number of courses, the type of entertainment, all these signaled one's status and intentions. For Vitellius, his dinner table was his throne room, and every dish was a proclamation. Historians still argue about the true extent of Roman culinary innovation. Were they merely adapting existing techniques, or truly pushing the boundaries of gastronomy with unique dishes like the Satura Lanx? It's a delightful mystery to ponder, So, as we leave the clatter of Vitellius's dining room behind, remember that the story of an emperor and his single colossal meal is more than just an amusing historical footnote. It's a glimpse into the heart of Roman society, a testament to its excesses and its aspirations, and a quiet reminder that even in the grand sweep of history, sometimes the most vivid characters are the ones who simply loved their food a little too much. Now, as the ancient Roman world fades into the soft echoes of the past, allow your thoughts to drift away like the gentle smoke from an oil lamp, slowly dissipating into the quiet night. The grand feasts, the bustling markets, the whispers of history, let them all recede gently, peacefully. Feel yourself relax, each breath becoming softer, deeper, the echoes of an empire, the murmur of forgotten banquets, are now just soft whispers carried on the wind. Let any lingering thoughts melt away, leaving only stillness and quiet. Your own journey through the day is drawing to a close, and with each slow, even breath, you can feel yourself sinking deeper into comfort. The day's stories are told, the history is complete. All that remains is the gentle quietude of the night. Sleep well, my friend.